John, we're going to think a little bit about how the Bible came to be formed in this conversation. And, Protestant and Catholic folk have different Old Testaments, right? How did that come about, and how did we get an Old Testament in the first place?
Well, let's start with how we got a Hebrew Bible in the first case. Now, in the book of Exodus, there is a passage in Exodus 24 that refers to the Book of the Covenant. And people take this to mean Exodus chapters 20 to 24. So you could say this would be the first occurrence of an authoritative book. Now, it has the Ten Commandments, it has some other more specific laws, but it isn't by any means a Bible as we would understand it. It doesn't have that kind of scope, but it was maybe the beginning of it. Another step would have been in the book of Deuteronomy. There's a story told in the book of Kings, how the book of the law was found in the temple. But the way that's applied, it only seems to affect a couple of things, mainly the centralization of the cult.
And when did that discovery take place?
No, this would have been in 621 BCE. So it's a long time after Moses. Stuff has been germinating for, 600 years at this point. But it's really after Deuteronomy that this gets worked up into a more substantial collection of laws. Now, the crucial moment, I think, in the formation of some kind of an authoritative book like this comes with Ezra in the Persian period, usually dated to the year 458. At this time, Judah was a province, if it even had that status, in the Persian Empire, very much a backwater. And as the story goes, Ezra went to the king and said, I would like to go and see if they're observing the law properly in Judah. And he had the book of the law that was in his hand. And people figured that this was some version of the Pentateuch or the Torah. Not quite the final one, but the important thing was that the Persian king seems to have said, all right, this is your law, this can be the law for Judah.
So that would have included things like the sacrificial system of Leviticus and all of the laws of kashrut.
It would.
Yeah.
They didn't have all the calendar right. They didn't have the Day of Atonement in the right place yet. But they were very much concerned. It was largely a combination of Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And they must have had some of the stories in there too. But from that time forward, the Torah of Moses, or the law of Moses, was the ancestral law of Judah. Now,
so this is from the middle of the 5th century.
5th century. Now, they probably continued to refine it. Exactly how closely they observed it is a whole other question, but it had that status. When the Greeks, the Syrians, took over in Jerusalem, Antiochus III issued a proclamation saying, you may live according to your ancestral law.
And that would have been
in 198 BCE. 30 years later, when Antiochus Epiphanes had some difficulty with the people of Judah, he suspended the right to live according to their ancestral law, and that set off the Maccabean revolt. But that's really where the idea of the law as fundamental comes from, I think. May come back to that. Now, besides that, you had other kinds of writings floating around. So you had all these books, sayings of the prophets.
Isaiah and Ezekiel and
yes,
Jeremiah.
And these all claim to be inspired. They typically began, this is the word of the Lord. Now, did people believe every time a prophet said, this is the word of the Lord? Well, probably not. But one of the things about these books that got preserved is that nearly all of them predicted the destruction of either Samaria or Jerusalem. And it happened.
And Samaria was destroyed
in 721 or 22, and Jerusalem in 586. And I think, say, Jeremiah, had fought with other prophets in his whole time because he was saying, you're going down. And it did go down. And at that point, I think people sat up and said, we'd better hold on to these.
That prophet knew something.
Yes, that prophet knew something. But as you were saying about Jesus saying on divorce, they didn't just preserve what they had, they added to it. And if a prophet didn't say something they thought he should have said, they elaborated that. And so by the time you get finished with the sayings of Jeremiah, it's a very long book. And we don't know really how much of it may have come from Jeremiah. But in any case, this is how you got a collection of prophets.
So that collecting and that expansion of prophetic sayings is happening in the, 5th, 4th centuries?
And the 5th, 4th, 3rd century, but say by the 2nd century, it seems to have been pretty much complete. One of the things that people point to is the book of Daniel, which is ranked with the prophets in the Christian Bible, is not included in the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. And the obvious explanation is that they had already more or less closed their collection of prophets. Now, there may have been other prophetic books out there, but this collection seems to have had some status, and it seems to have had that by the beginning of the 2nd century.
And that collection
BC.
Probably includes the big three and then the 12 minor?
And then the 12, yeah. But Daniel didn't make it into the Hebrew. But then there were other writings, and these included things like Proverbs. Now, there's a case to be made, I think, that the kind of material that you have in the book of Proverbs was the original curriculum for scribal education in ancient Israel, that is what they would teach people so they could learn how to write and learn a little ethics in the process. Now, that, was material that people were attached to, and so that got preserved. And now, Proverbs doesn't make any claim to be inspired. The Psalms make no claim to be inspired. These are human utterances.
Written by David,
explicitly, right? Yeah. Well, there may be a couple in there that were written by David, but you'd find, the things we found with the Dead Sea Scrolls is that you have a corpus of these. There were more Psalms floating around in the 2nd century. That part of the canon wasn't finished or closed probably until the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, after the second destruction of Jerusalem. It's at that time that you begin to get statements that the formally approved writings are either 22 or 24 books.
You have something in Josephus, too.
You have that in Josephus in his tract against Apion, and you have it in 4th Ezra, which was written about 100 AD. So by then, they were getting things nailed down. But by then, Judaism had spread. Now, there were a lot of books out there. The Dead Sea Scrolls brought to light a lot of books that we never knew existed. But there were also books that were translated into Greek or were written in Greek, and some of these were valued by communities, especially outside of Judah or Judea. Now, these would include things like the Wisdom of Solomon, which is in the Septuagint, or the Greek translation of the Bible. The Greek collection of scriptures has several books that aren't in the Hebrew. And that then would become actually...
The Maccabean histories, for instance.
No, the Maccabean histories, and that's an interesting one, because First Maccabees was surely written in Hebrew. It is a nationalistic Jewish text, and it is one of the great ironies that that's preserved as canonical by the Catholic Church, not by Judaism. My guess is the rabbis didn't like something about the Maccabees. The Maccabees may have taken too much authority into themselves.
So say a little bit then about Catholic and Protestant Bibles. Does it have something to do with this phenomenon of translation?
Well, it does, because, you see, there was a creeping edge to the canon. And at any point, there was always what I'd call a penumbra on the borders of the canon of books that were more or less canonical, and that there would be some disagreement as to whether they were in or out. Now, the book of Ben Sira, also known as Ecclesiasticus, written in Hebrew in the early 2nd century, probably before the book of Daniel.
2nd century, BC.
BC, right. Yeah, before the book of Daniel, wasn't included. My best guess is it wasn't included because he signed his name to it. So, and by then they thought that all really important stuff must be old. Daniel got in because this was thought to be the prophecies of Daniel back a few hundred years earlier.
During the Persian period.
Yeah. So that
but
was...
it's pretty clear that was written in the
180.
2nd century.
Very clear.
Yep.
Yeah. So you have that. You have the books of Maccabees. You have books like Tobit, Judith, Baruch. These are what we call the deuterocanonical books, because the Catholic Church formally accepted them as part of the Old Testament, but it did that at the Council of Trent.
But they were in the Latin Bibles of the Catholic Church,
They were
right?
in the Latin Bibles. But now, you see, if you go to the manuscripts of the Greek translations of the Bible, no two of them will have exactly the same collection of writings. And so you may have 151st Psalm. You may be missing Esther, as you sometimes are. You will have things like the Psalms of Solomon that nobody nowadays accepts as canonical. But in the manuscripts, this was a rolling corpus. So you always got the Pentateuch, you always got the major prophets and the 12 minor prophets, and then the last category always remained
a little fluid.
Fuzzy. And it remained fuzzy again then a little bit differently in the Latin Bible. And so this was rolling along fine until the Reformers came along. And Jerome, actually, who translated the Bible into Latin, he held to the Hebraica Veritas, which is, if it's not in Hebrew, it's not real. And
that principle then came to be applied?
But nonetheless, he translated the other books, and translated some of them badly. It's generally agreed that he rushed it. But they were there. And so then Luther went back to the principle of the Hebrew authority. So he threw out things like the Wisdom of Solomon and Ben Sira. Wisdom of Solomon, to my mind, is a great book, actually. It's a very interesting book. But this was the principle that went into it. Whereas then the Catholic Church came along and said, well, in that case, we are going to include
and that was at
everything
the Council of Trent.
The Council of Trent.
In the 16th century.
In the 16th century. So really, the decisions that determined what's in your Bible were made in the 16th century.
Well,
even those weren't quite final, because nowadays, if you go to a Protestant church, you can very well find a New Oxford Bible with the Apocrypha. And what Protestants call the Apocrypha are generally what Catholics call the deuterocanonical, which is to say canonical but not quite of the first rank. You know, that there's a recognition that these are kind of secondary.
Well, that answers my question.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.